Two glasses on the table, but only one man ordered. What happened to the other? Welcome to Twilight Clue. I am your host, Longford. Tell me, where are you listening from today? Your comments always make this journey special. Let's begin. The rain had been falling all afternoon. A soft persistence rather than a storm, the kind of drizzle that seeps into the bones of Oxford and makes the stone look older than it already is. I sat in the corner of the pub with a pint of bitter that I neither wanted nor needed, staring out at the blurred lamplight on the wet cobbles. The bells of St. Mary's drifted faintly across the High, tolling with the melancholy indifference of time. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that I had no business sitting there, that my life could have been better served in another city, another vocation. But such thoughts arrive too late and are easily drowned in ale. Across the room, a table had been left unclaimed by its patrons. Two glasses stood there, one drained almost to its heel, the other still untouched, its surface holding a thin skin of foam like the residue of a promise unfulfilled. I found myself staring at that second glass with an intensity disproportionate to the fact. Someone had ordered it. Someone had intended to drink it. But no one had. There is something quietly tragic about an untouched glass in a pub. It speaks of absence, of a guest who never arrived or a quarrel that ended before it began. Lewis would have laughed at me for the thought, and perhaps rightly so. He had a way of dismissing my more fanciful reflections with a smile that was both respectful and exasperated. He would say, "Sir, maybe they just changed their mind." And I would nod and let him think the matter closed, though in truth my mind would circle around the image like a moth trapped by a lamp. A small ordinary thing that seemed to whisper of something larger. The crossword in the day's Times had yielded me little satisfaction. The clue that kept gnawing was a simple one. Companion who disappears without trace, 7. I had written in phantom, though I knew it was wrong. I suspected the setter had something more cunning in mind, perhaps a wordplay that would only emerge when I had nearly abandoned the puzzle. The ghost of the wrong answer stayed with me, however, and when I glanced again at those two glasses, it seemed oddly apt. Phantom companion, presence without presence. Two ordered, one drunk, one left waiting. The landlord passed by my table collecting empties, and I asked without enthusiasm whether business had been brisk. He muttered that it had been the usual sort of Saturday, though quieter after the students left for the long vacation. He looked at the glasses with the same mild puzzlement I did, then carried on without comment. For him it was nothing. For me it was something I could not quite let go of. I thought of Schubert then, as I so often do. The slow movements that seemed to contain both resignation and defiance, as though the composer knew time was short, yet still found beauty in what little remained. I hummed a few bars under my breath, the sound lost beneath the clink of coins at the till. Music, like drink, dulled nothing for long, but for a moment it could carry me into a place where I was not required to think. When I left the pub, the rain had not relented. It hissed gently on the cobblestones and tapped against the darkened windows of shops. Oxford at night is less a city than a half-remembered dream. The colleges close their gates, the quadrangles lie in silence, and the past presses in upon you until you are almost suffocated by it. I walked without direction, my shoes splashing through shallow puddles, the taste of bitter still on my tongue. Somewhere a bicycle bell chimed, brief and plaintive, then vanished into the night. There is no particular reason I should remember that evening so clearly, except that later it became impossible to forget. The image of two glasses, one untouched, settled in my mind as firmly as any fact in a case file. It was nothing then, merely the sort of melancholy observation a man makes when he is too often alone. But it would not remain nothing. In time it would return to me, like that crossword clue whose solution hovers just beyond reach, waiting for the moment when you least expect it. And perhaps that is how many of our cases begin, not with a crime, not with a body, but with the simple awareness that something has been left unfinished. A gesture interrupted, a drink undrunk, a companion who disappears without leaving trace. It was Lewis who brought me the newspaper cutting, folded once, tucked into his notebook as though it were an afterthought. He placed it on my desk with a kind of reluctance, as though uncertain whether it merited my attention. The print was smudged from the rain. A small column, barely 2 inches, reporting the sudden death of Dr. Alan Forbes, Fellow of St. Athanasius College, Classics. The words "inquest concluded suicide" were written with the indifference of officialdom. To most it would have seemed an ending. To me it felt like the opening chord of a symphony unresolved. I read it twice, not because the prose demanded rereading, but because repetition has a way of revealing the shape of what is absent. A man of letters, widely respected, found lifeless in his rooms. No explanation offered beyond the pallid convenience of despair. Suicide is a verdict that satisfies institutions more than truth. It closes the door without troubling to ask who might still be left standing in the corridor. Lewis remarked that people in the college bar were muttering. He had an ear for mutterings. Someone had seen Forbes in the pub on the evening before his death. He had ordered 2 drinks, but only one had been consumed. The second glass remained on the table until the barman cleared it away. I felt the echo of my own solitary observation the previous night, the untouched glass across the room. A trivial coincidence, perhaps. But coincidences have the disquieting habit of whispering louder than facts. I asked Lewis what else he had gathered, though I already knew the answer would be little. He said the college was treating the matter quietly. Forbes had been admired, envied, occasionally disliked, which is to say he had been human. No one had seen him with company. No one had admitted to the second glass. The students were away on vacation, and the fellows were closing ranks with the reflex of long practice. Death in a college is not a scandal to be aired, but a stain to be quietly scrubbed. I remembered Forbes only vaguely. We had crossed paths once at a lecture on Horace. He had quoted the poet in a manner too fluent, too polished, as though the Latin were less a living tongue than a weapon in his hand. There had been wit in him, but also the kind of wit sharpened at another's expense. Such men collect admiration and resentment in equal measure, never quite knowing the difference. Still, I had not thought him the kind to fold into himself with despair. There was in the article no mention of a note, no hint of explanation. Suicide without words is like a crossword without clues. Unsolvable, unsatisfying, wrong. I walked later through the drizzle toward the Bodleian, the stones dark beneath my shoes. The scent of wet paper in the reading rooms greeted me like an old adversary. I thought of Forbes among these shelves, the rustle of his gown, the quickened impatience of his tread. He had lived in this city of books, where silence holds more secrets than speech. It seemed impossible he would leave without at least one final line written down. Yet if he had, the college had not released it. Silence again where there should have been sound. A small deduction flickered at the edge of thought, the untouched glass in the pub, and the report's omission of any visitor to his rooms. Silence on both counts, the same pattern of absence. Perhaps the clue lay not in what was said, but in what was missing. Lewis, cheerful as ever, thought it no more than gossip. He said men drink alone more often than they admit. I agreed outwardly, but inwardly the thought would not leave me. 2 drinks ordered, 1 left waiting. A man who dies without a word. The symmetry was too exact. As dusk crept into the city, I felt that old tightening in the chest, the sense that something was beginning, though no one else had yet noticed. Death in Oxford is never just death. It is an echo through cloisters, a misquoted poet, a half-finished line in a diary. Forbes's silence unsettled me more than any confession could have done, and so that night I folded the cutting into my pocket. The bells tolled vespers. The rain thickened, and I found myself listening for a whisper that was not there, but would not be ignored. The first time I stepped back into St. Athanasius after Forbes's death, the rain had eased into a mist that clung to the college walls like a veil. Oxford colleges are all the same in outline, quads of stone, staircases leading to rooms smelling of damp wool and ink, but each holds its own temperature of silence. St. Athanasius was colder than most. The porter, solemn and economical in his words, noted that the fellows were in a meeting and directed me to wait in the cloister. The echo of my shoes on the flagstones felt intrusive, like a visitor to a cathedral who has forgotten to whisper. Lewis beside me seemed ill at ease. He always disliked colleges. He said their walls kept people in as much as they kept the world out. I thought him half right. These walls preserved memory, but they also preserved secrets, and it was those I had come to listen for. The bursar received us with a politeness that carried the faint tang of irritation, as though our presence were both necessary and unwelcome. He spoke of Forbes in measured tones, admiring yet faintly dismissive, like a man appraising a painting whose value was greater than its appeal. He repeated the verdict of suicide, his voice just a little too quick, the way one hurries through lines already rehearsed. I marked the cadence, knowing that words spoken too smoothly often conceal roughness beneath. The chaplain came next, a gentleman with soft eyes that seemed perpetually downcast. He spoke of Forbes's faith, or lack of it, with a kind of sorrow tinged by resignation. He said nothing unkind, yet there was a hesitancy in his phrasing, as if he feared his own words might betray more than he wished. I found myself listening, less to what he said and more to what he left unsaid, the pauses that hung like shadows between sentences. It was in the library that I felt the college most vividly. The air carried the must of old bindings and the faint sweetness of dust disturbed by light. A long table bore the impression of recent use, an open atlas, a volume of Horace lying face down, and a blotter with the ink not yet fully dry. The librarian, a woman with sharp features and an economy of expression, insisted that Forbes had been there only days before, researching something about inscriptions. Her evasiveness was more eloquent than any detail she offered. She said she did not recall what books he borrowed, though her fingers lingered on the lending ledger as she spoke. That hesitation was small, but it burned itself into my memory. Lewis asked whether Forbes had enemies. The librarian smiled faintly, as though amused by the bluntness of the question. In colleges, she said, one must learn that friendship and rivalry are not opposites, but overlapping categories. I thought her words truer than she realized. In Oxford, admiration is often the mask worn by envy, and affection is seldom far from disdain. As we left the library, I paused before a portrait in the hall. Forbes himself, painted a decade earlier, the eyes watchful, the mouth fixed in a half-smile that might have been charm or calculation. Beneath the frame, a brass plate recorded his chairmanship of a disciplinary committee years ago. I remembered vaguely the case. A young scholar accused of misconduct, his career cut short in the aftermath. The name escaped me, but the bitterness of such ruin does not easily vanish. A reminder, perhaps, that the past lingers in these walls longer than the men who walk them. One detail returned to me as we were leaving. The porter had mentioned that Forbes's rooms were locked immediately after his death, and that only the master and the bursar had entered since. Yet the blotter in the library bore fresh ink, and the librarian's hesitation suggested that someone had borrowed books in his name after his death. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but small things, in my experience, carry the weight of truth more often than grand gestures. As dusk settled over the quads, I felt again that old unease, the sense that the college itself was complicit, that its stones absorbed secrets as readily as they absorbed rain. Lewis asked what I thought. I said only that the shadows here were thicker than most. And though shadows are by nature ambiguous, they also have edges. If you follow them long enough, you reach the object that casts them. It is the nature of colleges that everyone is both known and unknown. The names are etched in the minutes of committees, the voices echo through high tables, yet the real selves remain concealed behind ritual and routine. I began to sketch the outlines of those whose lives intersected most closely with Forbes's. They appeared at first like silhouettes cast upon a wall, shapes discernible, but never quite in full light. Professor Chalmers was the first to emerge from the shadows, a man of wit, polished and practiced, whose conversation sparkled but carried a sting. I remembered hearing him lecture once, clever, quick, and faintly cruel. He spoke of Forbes with the enthusiasm of a biographer, praising his scholarship, but every compliment carried the faintest suggestion of mockery. Lewis said he seemed friendly enough. I thought of Cicero's observation that nothing is so false as a smile that conceals envy. Chalmers's envy had the sheen of sophistication, but envy nonetheless. Then there was Dr. Helena Arkwright, tall, poised, with a mind as sharp as the cut of her sentences. She denied intimacy with Forbes, but in her denial lay a touch of rehearsed precision, as if she had anticipated the question long before it was asked. I saw the way her hands rested on the arms of her chair, steady yet too still, like a statue holding itself against tremors. She spoke of him as a colleague, never as a friend. It was the absence of warmth, not the presence of hostility, that struck me. In Oxford, Such absences can be as telling as declarations. Simon Gray, the graduate student, appeared more transparent, though transparency is often another kind of mask. He confessed resentment freely, speaking of his thesis that Forbes had condemned with savage remarks. His bitterness seemed genuine, almost refreshing in its lack of polish. Yet there was something too deliberate in his self-presentation, as though he wished me to believe in his anger while distracting me from something quieter. Lewis said he was the most obvious candidate. I thought obviousness itself was suspicious. Each of them in their own way held cause for discontent. Envy, wounded pride, the ruin of ambition. Yet motive, however compelling, is not proof. The truth seldom resides in reason alone. It is often lodged in detail, a misplaced word, an overlooked gesture. It was during Arkwright's account that such a detail flickered. She said Forbes had been reading Horace in the days before his death. She quoted a line, so she claimed, his favorite, "Pulvis et umbra sumus." We are dust and shadow. But I remembered that very phrase had appeared in the newspaper cutting describing Forbes's funeral, attributed to the chaplain. Arkwright had used it too readily, as if she were reciting from the article rather than her own memory of Forbes. The misstep was slight, almost nothing, but it lodged itself in my mind like grit in a shoe. Later, in the quad, Lewis asked me what I thought of them. I told him they were all plausible, which is another way of saying none yet convinced me. He smiled at that, and said I was being deliberately obscure. Perhaps I was, but in truth I was waiting. The silhouettes were forming, and I needed the light to sharpen them before they became portraits. As we left, the porter handed me a scrap of paper he claimed to have found near Forbes's staircase. It was no more than a fragment of handwriting, the tail end of a sentence torn away. Yet I recognized the hand, rounded, meticulous, unmistakably Forbes's. The words were incomplete, but one phrase lingered, meeting arranged. That, coupled with Arkwright's misplaced quotation, unsettled the neat narrative of suicide the college seemed eager to sustain. Walking back through the mist, I thought of the crossword clue again. Companion who disappears without trace. 7. I had tried Phantom before, and it still lingered, unsolved. As I crossed the cobbled street, the thought came that perhaps the clue was less about disappearance than about substitution. A word that replaced another, like one memory overwriting the true event. I tucked the paper into my coat and told myself to look again at the puzzle when the day was quieter. The city was hushed, the lamps glowing in the fog, and I felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and fatigue. The case was not yet a case, only a death with questions lingering like smoke. But I knew already that the silhouettes would not stay silhouettes for long. They would take shape, and when they did, the shadows they cast would be darker than any rain-soaked quad could provide. It was Lewis who found the diary fragment. He handed it to me in the porter's lodge with the satisfaction of a man convinced he had unearthed a clue of consequence. A torn scrap, folded, smudged at the edges by damp fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably Forbes's. The neat, rounded letters of a scholar accustomed to marking essays in margins too narrow for untidy strokes. Most of the page was missing, but one line remained. Wednesday meeting at then abruptly severed, as though the hand that wrote it had been silenced or the page deliberately destroyed. Lewis, hopeful, said it might be the very thing to prove Forbes had expected company that night. I agreed it might, yet the more I looked at it, the less certain I felt. There was no indication of place or person, only the faint trace of a Latin quotation beneath the words, half-finished, non omnis moriar. I shall not wholly die. Horace again, recycled and refracted through too many mouths. The phrase seemed almost too apt, as though chosen deliberately. But by whom and why? I carried the scrap into the college library, where the air smelled of parchment and the dust that gathers when nothing is touched for weeks. The librarian pretended not to watch me as I laid it on the table. She had said she could not recall what Forbes had borrowed, yet her eyes strayed again to the ledger as I unfolded the paper. I wondered if the missing half-page had passed through her hands, if she knew more than she allowed. The silence between us was not hostile, but it was complicit, and I let it stand. The blotter from before returned to my thoughts. The ink not yet dry, the impression of words now blurred. If Forbes's diary bore this note of a meeting, why was there no corresponding entry in the blotter's shadow? A trivial inconsistency, perhaps. But trivial inconsistencies have led me further than confessions. In the quad, the rain had lifted, leaving the stones slick with a sheen that reflected the sky. I thought of Forbes writing that line, whether in confidence or fear, whether expecting a friend or an enemy. Meeting where? The absence of a location seemed deliberate. Either he trusted the reader already knew, or he intended to conceal it from anyone who might later pry. And who was the reader meant to be? Himself or another? Lewis was eager to draw conclusions. He suggested Gray. A student would hardly merit a written record, he said, unless the meeting was clandestine. I reminded him that secrecy attaches itself just as often to colleagues as to pupils. He looked unconvinced, but then Lewis never placed much weight in subtlety. He wanted lines to connect clearly, while I have long suspected the truth hides in the gaps between them. That evening, in my flat, I opened the Times crossword. A clue I had abandoned days before returned to me. Record kept by scholar, partly torn 5. The answer was diary, of course. Childishly simple once seen, and yet it had eluded me until now. The coincidence was absurd, even laughable, but the kind of absurdity that seemed to mirror life too neatly. A diary torn, a diary incomplete, a diary that left more silence than revelation. I read the fragment again before bed, tracing the letters with my finger as though contact might reveal more than sight. Wednesday, meeting at... The dash lingered, more eloquent than any name could have been. I thought of all the meetings held in Oxford's private rooms, in libraries, in cloisters, in pubs where 2 glasses stood and only one was drained. The city is built on meetings arranged and forgotten, on appointments never kept, and yet this one had ended in death. Sleep did not come easily. The phrase returned non omnis moria. Was it Forbes's own voice, proclaiming his memory would not wholly vanish, or another hand's mocking him in absentia? I closed my eyes and heard the bells across the city toll the hour. The scrap of paper lay on the table beside me, whispering its half-truths into the darkness. It struck me then that silence can be written just as easily as words. A torn page is not absence but design, and in that design, I sensed the faint outline of someone clever enough to let the missing speak more loudly than the written. She arrived quietly, as women of her kind often do, with an air of belonging that required no introduction. Mrs. Clara Devine. Her widow, though she carried the title less as a burden than as a kind of sombre adornment. I met her first in the master's drawing-room, where the curtains held the scent of old dust and the fire had long since sunk into embers. She spoke little at first, yet her presence filled the room more completely than the voices of the fellows who had gathered earlier in the day. She claimed to have known Forbes long ago during her student days. The phrase was delivered without emphasis, and yet it hung in the air like a faint perfume that lingers after its source has gone. I asked what she remembered of him, and she smiled in that evasive manner cultivated by those who know how to survive Oxford's polite inquisitions. She remembered his kindness, she said, his brilliance, his occasional impatience, each word carefully chosen, polished, and incomplete. Later that evening, I invited her for a drink at a quiet inn near the river, a place where the lamps shone dimly on dark wood and the air smelled faintly of hops and wet wool. 2 glasses stood between us, and I found myself recalling the untouched pint in the college pub, the glass left waiting for a companion who never came. She raised her glass with a grace that seemed habitual, yet her hand lingered on the stem too long, as though she required the glass as a shield. I asked where she had been on the evening of Forbes's death. She said at home alone. A pause followed, deliberate, as if she wished me to consider the loneliness, not the absence of witnesses. Lewis, had he been present, would have frowned at the neatness of it all. But I had no proof, only a growing unease that her solitude was rehearsed. She asked in turn about me. Did I enjoy my work? Did I believe in justice? I answered, though not with the candor she perhaps hoped for. My work was a habit. Justice was a word I mistrusted. She smiled as though she understood, though I doubted she did. People imagine they understand the lonely, when what they grasp is only the surface of silence. It was a crossword clue once again that unsettled my thoughts. Companion who disappears without trace, 7. Still unsolved. I glanced at her across the table and felt that she too was a clue written in deceptive brevity. Presence without presence, a margin rather than a sentence. I studied her gestures more closely than her words. The way she turned her glass slightly each time she set it down. The way her gaze slid toward the window when I asked directly about Forbes. Small evasions, almost imperceptible, yet they formed a pattern not unlike the misprints in a flawed edition, minor errors that reveal something about the press, if not the text itself. When she spoke of Forbes, she used the past tense reluctantly, as though correcting herself each time. He was brilliant. He was impatient. But once she slipped, saying he is a man whose words stay with you is not was. I noted it, though I did not confront her. It might have been no more than habit, but habit, like the turn of a glass, is seldom meaningless. We parted with courtesy. She pressed my hand with the warmth of one who knows precisely the degree of intimacy she allows. I walked back through the damp streets with a sense of unfinished conversation, the taste of bitter lingering, the faint perfume of her presence still about me. At my desk later, I unfolded the diary fragment again. Wednesday, meeting at... The dash now looked less like an omission and more like an invitation. Meeting at nowhere, meeting at silence, meeting at the margin where words fail. Clara Devine, a woman in the margins of Forbes's life and now in mine. I did not know then what role she played, whether truth or distraction, companion or phantom. Only that she left me with the same unease as an unsolved clue. Waiting patiently in the corner of the grid, whispering its presence each time the eye strayed past it, the case seemed, for a brief time, to arrange itself into a neat diagram, as though the pieces of a crossword had finally fallen into place. It was Simon Gray, the young man with bitterness carved into every word he spoke, who occupied the center of that diagram. His resentment was too candid, his failures too clearly linked to Forbes's severity. Lewis, satisfied, said he could not imagine a man with more reason to hate. I reminded him that reason is seldom the same as action, but my words lacked conviction even to myself. We found in Gray's lodgings a collection of papers that only deepened suspicion. Drafts of his thesis, annotated with angry marginalia, notes copied in haste from library texts, some underlined with a violence that tore the page. Among them, tucked between 2 volumes of Horace, was a letter never sent. Written in a hand that shook with fury, it accused Forbes of humiliation, of deliberate sabotage, of cruelty masked as scholarship. If anything could stand as motive, this was it. Lewis said the matter was obvious. He had quarreled, he had threatened, and Forbes was now dead. He asked whether we ought to act at once. I said not yet, though in truth I was tempted by the simplicity of it. For a man grown weary of labyrinths, the straight path has its appeal. Gray himself did not deny his bitterness. He told me he had once confronted Forbes in the quad, shouting accusations heard by others. He said he was drunk, humiliated, and glad to admit it. His candor was almost too perfect, as though he wished us to see the fury while hiding what lay beneath. And yet, watching him speak, I felt the anger was genuine. What unsettled me was not his vehemence, but the way it seemed prepared, offered like a performance. That evening, alone, I thought again of the diary fragment. Wednesday, meeting at... If Gray had been the companion, would Forbes have dignified him with such a note? It seemed unlikely. A student was a present summoned, not one arranged. The fragment suggested equality, if not intimacy. And Gray, for all his fury, did not carry the weight of equal standing. I leafed again through the Times crossword, its half-completed squares a mirror of the case. One clue remained stubborn. Scholars' undoing revealed in marginal notes. 6. I had scrawled palim, before stopping, uncertain. Later the answer arrived palimpsest. Layers upon layers, each inscription obscuring another, the past written over but never erased. I could not help but think of Gray's papers, the margins filled with rage, the past overwritten but still visible beneath. A tempting solution. Too tempting. Lewis, impatient, said we were wasting time. The college would prefer a swift conclusion, and Gray was the obvious culprit. He asked whether I could not, for once, accept the plain evidence before us. I told him evidence is rarely plain, and when it appears so, it is often painted. He sighed, accustomed to my evasions, and said I was being willfully obscure. Perhaps I was. Yet something in me resisted the ease of it all. I remembered then Helena Arkwright's misquoted Horace and Clara Devine's slip of the tongue. Small errors, each too slight to prove anything, yet they lingered. Gray's fury was large, bold, written in capital letters across the page. But truth, I have often found, prefers italics, quiet, slanted, half-hidden. Still, we proceeded as duty required. Gray was questioned more formally, his papers examined, his movements the night of Forbes's death scrutinized. He admitted being near the college, but claimed he had gone home before the hour of death. The alibi was weak, the bitterness undeniable. For a day or two, I allowed myself to imagine the case closing around him, the diagram solved, and yet late one night I returned to the pub where Forbes had ordered his final drinks. The landlord recalled Gray, yes, but days before, not that night. More importantly, the register of payments showed 2 pints ordered, 1 paid, a companion unacknowledged, a glass untouched. Gray had not the subtlety for such absence. His fury was noisy, not silent. And silence, I felt, was the language in which Forbes's death had been written. So Gray became, in my mind, a red herring, convincing enough to mislead, satisfying enough to tempt closure. But even herrings, red or otherwise, swim in shoals. One misdirection conceals another. And as I folded the diary fragment again, I understood that the clue lay not in Gray's margins, but in the blank spaces between. I returned to the pub where Forbes had been last seen, not because I expected revelation, but because places remember in ways people cannot. The room smelled of beer and damp coats, the air thick with the residue of a dozen half-forgotten conversations. A public house at its heart is an archive, not of documents, but of gestures, of laughter cut short, of glasses left half-drained. The landlord was obliging enough, though his memory moved with the sluggishness of a man repeating his story for the 5th time. He recalled Forbes ordering 2 pints that evening. He recalled that only 1 was touched. He could not recall the companion. Or perhaps there had been no companion at all. His tone carried the shrug of indifference. I asked if anyone had paid for both drinks. He consulted the register, an old exercise book with entries scrawled in biro. Only 1 drink recorded, though 2 had been poured. A trivial matter to him, a detail to me. Lewis, standing nearby, said perhaps the 2nd glass was simply a mistake. I told him mistakes are seldom poured so carefully. Beer, unlike words, does not appear by accident. He sighed, knowing better than to argue, but his silence carried its own skepticism. I stared at the table where Forbes had sat, now occupied by 2 students playing cards. I watched their hands move, their laughter rise and fall. The table was the same, the glasses different, the echo of that night still faintly present. 2 drinks ordered, 1 left untouched, a fact without an explanation, and therefore a fact of consequence. On the wall, a notice board carried the usual clutter, advertisements for rooms, tutorials, concerts. Among them, a crossword pinned in jest, its squares half filled by patrons. 1 clue caught my eye, disappearing partner leaving no trace, 7. I felt the faint shiver of recognition. The same clue I had struggled with in the Times, still unanswered. Still waiting. Coincidence, perhaps, or something else. Oxford has a habit of weaving its threads too neatly for me to trust coincidence. The landlord mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Forbes had not lingered long. He had drunk slowly, staring at the untouched glass as though expecting it to move. Then he had risen, paid for 1 drink, and walked out into the night. No one had followed. No one had claimed the 2nd glass. It seemed to me that the absence of a companion was, in itself, a form of presence. Whoever was meant to sit opposite Forbes had left a mark by not arriving. The untouched glass became a silent witness, more eloquent than any testimony. I wondered whether Forbes had been stood up, betrayed, or merely abandoned. Each possibility held its own shade of melancholy, and each could have led him back to the solitude of his rooms, where death had found him. Lewis suggested we had been chasing shadows. A student could have ordered the 2nd drink and walked away. The staff could have miscounted. I did not argue. Sometimes it is easier to let him believe the ground solid beneath his feet, while I continued to feel it shift beneath mine. I left the pub and stood beneath the dripping eaves. The rain had begun again, a thin drizzle sliding down the collar of my coat. I imagined Forbes pausing in that very spot, looking up at the college tower through the mist, the sound of bells muffled by rain. Did he expect someone still to come? Did he carry the weight of disappointment, or the sharper weight of betrayal? Back at home, I opened the crossword again. The clue remained unanswered. Disappearing partner, leaving no trace, 7. I considered spectre, shadow, phantom, all unsatisfactory. Then the thought came unbidden, wraith. A presence without substance. A partner that fades before the touch. 7 letters, a fit. I wrote it in, the pen scratching faintly in the silence. Yet the satisfaction was hollow. A solution on the page is not a solution in life. Still, the second glass lingered in my mind. Wraith or not, someone had been there, even if only in absence. And in Oxford, absence has a way of leaving deeper marks than presence ever could. It was in the senior common room, late in the afternoon, that Helena Arkwright's voice first revealed itself more clearly than she intended. She was speaking of Forbes with that careful detachment cultivated by academics. Her sentences polished, her tone neither affectionate nor hostile. And then, almost casually, she quoted Horace. She said Forbes had once reminded her that the poet wrote vita brevis, ars longa. Life is short, art long. The words slipped too easily, too quickly. I let them hang for a moment before moving on, though in my mind I heard the faintest jarring note. Horace had never written such a phrase. It was Hippocrates centuries earlier, whose aphorism had been translated that way. Horace had said something altogether different. And Forbes, meticulous pedant that he was, would never have misattributed it. The mistake was hers, or the misquotation was deliberate. Either way, it unsettled me more than any confession might have done. I did not confront her. I never do, not in the moment. Confrontation closes doors, and what I needed was to keep them open. Lewis afterwards said he had not noticed. He said perhaps she had simply misspoken. I told him that misspeaking is often the first language of guilt. He muttered that I was making too much of too little. Yet too little is often exactly the right measure. I carried the thought with me into the library, where the smell of paper thickened with the damp air drifting in from the quad. The ledger still rested on its desk, its spine cracked, its pages filled with names that might as well have been epitaphs. 2 books had been borrowed in Forbes's name after his death, though the librarian insisted otherwise. I placed my finger on the entries, tracing the ink, and thought of Arkwright again. A scholar does not misquote by accident, just as a librarian does not forget what she has seen. These were errors with weight. That night alone I returned to my crossword. The clue read scholar borrowing from wrong source, 6. I had left it blank before. Now the answer came easily. Author. A word twisted into irony by the wrong citation, a reminder that even authority can falter. The grid, like the case, revealed itself in fragments, each letter forming slowly, often in places where I least expected it. Clara Devine came to mind too. She had spoken of Forbes in the present tense, not the past. Was it habit or denial or something more dangerous? Women like her occupy margins, but margins are not empty. They are the spaces where meaning hides. Between her slip and Arkwright's error, I felt the silence around Forbes's death grow more articulate. The diary fragment, the glass left untouched, the misquoted poet, all spoke in a chorus of absence. I thought of Forbes himself, the man I had glimpsed once at a lecture. Brilliant, yes, but merciless in his precision. A man who lived by the text, who would never have forgiven a misattribution. How cruel, then, that the only words left in his wake were misremembered, misquoted, stolen from another. Death is not only the absence of breath, but the distortion of memory. Lewis asked me later that week whether I truly believed Arkwright capable of murder. He said she seemed too composed, too professional, too careful. I reminded him that composure is often armor. The most dangerous people are seldom those who shout. He laughed and said I was reading too much into poetry. Perhaps I was. But in Oxford, poetry is never just poetry. It is code, confession, disguise. As the evening drew on, I found myself back in the pub, staring once more at the 2 glasses I could not unsee. One drained, one untouched. It occurred to me then that Arkwright's misquotation was another kind of untouched glass, something ordered, something poured, but never quite consumed. A gesture incomplete, left waiting on the table. The bells tolled from St. Giles as I walked home, the sound hollow in the mist. I thought of Horace, of Hippocrates, of the endless parade of borrowed words that mask the truth. And I thought of Forbes, silenced, his last line torn from a diary, his memory rewritten by those who remained. The misquoted poet was not an accident. It was a sign. Of what I did not yet know. Only that meaning lay hidden there, waiting for the one who cared to listen. The file was not difficult to find. Colleges hoard paper the way misers hoard coins, and the past once written is seldom destroyed. In the archives of St. Athanasius lay the record of a disciplinary committee chaired by Forbes nearly 20 years before. The folder smelled of dust and iron clips, the scent of age that clings even to forgotten scandals. The name leapt at me. Helena Arkwright. She had been accused of plagiarism, of lifting passages from a rival's article and weaving them into her own with subtle changes. It was Forbes who had uncovered the transgression. The committee had not ruined her entirely. She had survived, resumed her career, even flourished, but the shadow of exposure must have remained. Oxford forgets nothing. Its walls echo with reputations damaged long after their owners are gone. I read the minutes with a kind of detached sorrow. Forbes's remarks were merciless, written with the precision of a man who considered words to be scalpel and verdict both. Arkwright had defended herself with brilliance, but not with success. The committee had censured her, though not dismissed her. Enough to wound, not enough to kill. Perhaps that was crueler still. I folded the papers and felt their weight as though it were more than paper. I thought again of her misquotation, the way she had spoken Horace's words as though they belonged to another. Was it mere error, or was it the echo of her own past, misattribution as a form of confession? Lewis, when I showed him the file, shook his head. He said people change. He said old grievances fade. I told him Oxford does not allow them to fade. It preserves them like flies in amber. He smiled wearily and said I was making poetry again. Perhaps I was. But poetry, I have learned, often conceals more truth than prose. The diary fragment pressed itself into my mind once more. Meeting at... If Arkwright had feared exposure a second time, perhaps the meeting was with Forbes. Perhaps he had threatened to reveal something anew. She was capable of composure, of poise, but also, I suspected, of desperation. I walked through the college corridors that night, the floorboards creaking beneath my shoes, the lamps casting thin shadows along the walls. In the silence I imagined the voices of past committees, past verdicts, past scholars ruined. The building itself seemed to whisper that no humiliation is ever truly forgotten. It was then I noticed a photograph pinned on the notice board in a side passage. A faded group portrait, scholars in gowns, their faces blurred by time. Forbes stood at the center, stern, erect, his hand resting on a chair. And beside him, slightly behind, Arkwright, younger then, her eyes turned not toward the camera but toward him, a glance captured in silver nitrate, preserved longer than memory. I stared at it until my vision blurred. The past unveiled is never neutral. It carries its accusation silently. At home later, I returned again to my crossword. The clue exposure leads to punishment in College File 7. I smiled faintly at the irony. The answer, once seen, was obvious: censure. The word fitted neatly into the grid, each letter falling into place with the inevitability of verdict. Exposure, punishment, file, and Arkwright censured long ago, still standing in the shadows of Forbes's judgment. I poured myself a whiskey, the glass heavy in my hand, and thought of the untouched pint in the pub, of the misquoted poet, of the torn diary. Each piece now glimmered faintly in the same direction, though the path between them remained shrouded. I could not yet name the companion who never arrived, but I knew the meeting had been meant, and that the past was not silent in it. Lewis telephoned that night, his voice brisk. He asked whether I was close to an answer. I said only that I was close to a memory, which is not the same thing. He laughed, accustomed to my evasions, and bade me rest. But rest was the one thing I could not manage. For in my mind the past had already been unveiled, and it stared back at me with eyes that were both Forbes's and Arkwright's. I confronted her quietly. In a room that smelled of polished wood and extinguished fires, Helena Arkwright sat before me with her customary poise, her eyes steady, her hands folded as though preparing to defend a thesis once more. I told her of the file in the archives, of the censure, of Forbes's merciless words written 2 decades earlier. She did not deny it. She merely nodded, as if acknowledging something inevitable. I spoke of the diary fragment, the arranged meeting on Wednesday. I spoke of the books borrowed in Forbes's name after his death, of the misquoted poet, of the untouched glass. Still she said nothing. Silence in her was not absence but resistance. It was Lewis who shifted impatiently in the chair beside me, his voice breaking the stillness with questions that she ignored. Her eyes remained on me, waiting, as though only one interlocutor mattered. At last she said in a voice quieter than I had expected that Forbes had summoned her. He had threatened, she claimed, to expose her once again, this time over a grant application embroidered with false citations. She had gone to meet him, yes, but she swore she had left before his death. She said she had not touched the second glass. She said many things, all carefully arranged, none sufficient, and yet I could not wholly disbelieve her, for there was no triumph in her confession, no satisfaction in her voice. Only weariness, the fatigue of one who has carried the same weight too long. I wondered whether guilt had already consumed her, whether my role was not to convict but merely to observe. I thought again of Clara Devine, her hand turning the glass, her slip into the present tense. I thought of Gray's fury, Chalmers's envy, the librarian's hesitations. Each of them cast shadows across Forbes's death, yet none resolved into full light. The case, like the crossword, could be completed on paper, but never in life. Still, I knew enough. The untouched glass was no accident. The misquoted poet was no mere lapse. The past had been unveiled, and in it lay a woman who had been scarred, humiliated, and threatened once too often. Whether she had poured the poison or merely contemplated it, I could not say. The truth was less an answer than a shadow, dark, persuasive, incomplete. Lewis asked what we should do. He looked at me with the dogged loyalty of a man who wanted certainty, who believed in the firm lines of law. I told him we would let the matter rest. He frowned, puzzled, but he did not argue. He has long since learned that my resolutions seldom satisfy. That night I returned to the pub. I ordered one drink. I let it sit before me untouched, while I stared at the empty chair across the table. I thought of Forbes, of Arkwright, of all the companions who vanished, leaving only silence in their place. The bells of St. Mary's tolled in the distance, the sound carrying like a lament through the damp night air. At home I opened the crossword for the last time. Only one clue remained. Silent witness, glass left standing, 5. I smiled faintly, recognizing the setter's irony, though it could not have been intentional. The answer was ghost. I wrote it in, each letter steady, final, inevitable. And then I closed the paper, as though closing a case. But closure is a word better suited to files than to lives. For me, the ending was not resolution but ache. Arkwright's face remained before me, composed, resigned, unreadable. Clara Devine's perfume lingered. Forbes's silence pressed against me like a weight. We are all, I suppose, dust and shadow, as Horace reminded us, and yet some shadows haunt more deeply than substance ever could. Substance ever could.